The advertisement was written in pencil on a torn piece of brown paper, pinned to the post office wall between a wanted poster and a notice about a missing mule. It read, "Cattle rancher, age 38, owns 400 acres outside Red Rock Flats. Seeks a wife. No romantic promises. Fair treatment guaranteed. Room, board, and security offered in exchange for companionship and domestic partnership. Respond to Elias Cord, Box 7. 12 women read it that month. 11 walked away without a second glance. One wrote back. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 26 years old, widowed once, and carrying a secret so dangerous that leaving her hometown wasn't just a choice, it was survival. When the two of them met for the first time at the dusty train depot in Red Rock Flats, they shook hands like strangers closing a business deal. No warmth. No pretense. But before Clara climbed into Elias's wagon, she stopped. She turned to him with eyes that held something he couldn't quite name, not fear, not desperation, something older and harder than both. She said, "I'll marry you, Mr. Cord. But I have one condition. And if you can't honor it, I'll get back on that train right now." Elias looked at her. He was a man who had negotiated cattle prices, survived droughts, and buried 2 ranch hands. He was not a man easily rattled. But something about the way she said those words, quiet, absolute, carved from stone, made his jaw tighten. He said, "Tell me the condition." She told him. And just like that, the life Elias Cord thought he understood began to unravel. Red Rock Flats was the kind of place the rest of the world forgot on purpose. It sat at the edge of the Sonoran Desert like something God had dropped and didn't bother picking back up. The sky there was a brutal blue, too wide, too empty, and the sun didn't just shine, it pressed down on everything like a hot iron on wet cloth. The dust was red. The wind was dry. And the silences between moments were so long and so heavy that men had gone quietly mad just from listening to them. Elias Cord had lived there for 11 years. He'd come west after the war, not the big war, a smaller, meaner one that never made the history books, the kind fought between men over land and water and old grudges that ran deeper than rivers. He'd left Virginia with a burned house behind him and $32 in his boot, and he'd ridden until the land changed and the faces changed and nobody knew his name. He bought the Red Rock acreage from a widow who was leaving for California and never looking back. 400 acres of scrub, cactus, and possibility. He broke the ground himself. Built the fence posts one by one. Hauled water from the creek 3 miles east until he learned to dig a well. He was not a man who complained about hard work because hard work was the only religion he'd ever managed to keep. The cattle came slowly. First a small herd of 12. Then 40. Then, after a brutal year of drought and 2 years of careful management, just over 200 head. The house he built was plain. Pine boards, 2 rooms, a porch that leaned slightly to the left because the foundation shifted in the first winter. He'd always meant to fix it. He never did. There was always something more urgent, a sick calf, a broken fence line, a water pump that needed replacing. The porch stayed crooked, and Elias got used to it the way men get used to all the things they can't quite fix in themselves. His neighbors, what few there were, called him a fair man. Not warm. Not the kind who came to dances or stayed for supper after church. But fair. If he said he'd pay you Thursday, you got paid Thursday. If he said the cattle would be ready by spring, they were ready by spring. In a land where a man's word was the only currency that couldn't be stolen, Elias Cord was considered rich. But the ranch was quiet in a way that had started to bother him. He didn't like admitting that. Bothered was a soft word, and Elias didn't deal in soft things. But in the evenings, when the desert cooled and the coyotes started their distant conversations and the stars spread out above the flats like God had spilled a jar of salt, in those evenings, the silence had weight. It sat across the table from him at dinner. It followed him to bed. It was there in the morning when he woke before the sun and made coffee strong enough to strip paint. He'd been engaged once, 7 years back. a schoolteacher from Tucson named Margaret. She'd ridden out to see the ranch, stayed 2 days, been polite and careful the entire time, and then written him a letter from the stage station in town. She said she admired him. She said the land was beautiful in its own harsh way. She said she was sorry, but she couldn't live somewhere that felt like the end of the world. Elias had read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the stove. He didn't blame her. Not really. He looked at the flats through her eyes for those 2 days, and he understood what she saw, a man and a landscape both too stubborn to soften for anyone. But 3 years later, something changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It happened the way most important things happen, slowly, without announcement. His foreman, a good man named Decker, got married and moved his family onto a small plot 12 miles south. 2 of his seasonal hands didn't come back after winter. And one morning in February, Elias sat down to a breakfast he'd cooked himself, in a kitchen that smelled of old coffee and nothing else, and he thought, this isn't enough. He sat with that thought for a while, the way you sit with a stone in your boot, aware of it, uncomfortable, but not sure you want to stop long enough to deal with it. Then he wrote the advertisement. He pinned it up. He waited. And then came the letter, careful handwriting, short sentences, no flattery. Just the facts of a woman who needed a new life and was willing to work for one. He'd written back, come to Red Rock Flats. We'll talk. She came. And standing at that depot, with her single leather bag and her steady eyes and her one impossible condition, Elias Cord felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the silence in his chest might finally have something to say. He just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost him. She said, "There is a man following me. His name is Harlan Voss. He is my late husband's brother, and he believes I owe him something I will never give him. If he finds me, and he will find me, eventually, I need to know that you will stand with me. Not fight my battles. Just stand. Be the wall between his word and mine. That is the condition." The depot behind them smelled of coal smoke and axle grease. A dog slept under the bench near the door. Somewhere in the distance, a horse was being shod, the hammer ringing out in clean, metallic beats against the afternoon air. Elias didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at Clara Voss, this woman who was proposing to trade her domestic labor and her presence for his name and his land, and he tried to read the thing behind her eyes. He was a man who judged cattle on what you could see and livestock on what you couldn't. He used both skills now. She was not trembling. She was not begging. Her chin was level, her bag held in both hands, and she was entirely prepared, he understood, to get back on the train. The train that was still idling at the platform. The conductor was walking the length of it, checking the car connections, not paying them any attention. Elias said, "What does Harlan Voss want from you?" She said, "Land. My husband left me 40 acres outside of Millard County. Not much, but it connects to a larger parcel that Harlan has always wanted. He says the will was forged. It wasn't. But truth is slower than money, and Harlan has both lawyers and guns, and I have neither. And what makes you think coming out here stops him? Distance slows men down. A wife's legal status complicates property claims. And out here." She paused, the faintest flicker of something moving across her expression. "Out here, I heard you were a fair man." He almost smiled at that. "Almost," he said. "If Harlan Voss shows up on my land, he becomes my problem as much as yours. You understand that?" She said. "I understand it better than you do." That should have been the warning. He heard it the way you hear thunder from across a mountain range, present but distant, easy to dismiss as something that might pass before it reaches you. He said, "All right, Mrs. Voss. I'll honor the condition." They were married 4 days later at the courthouse in Red Rock Flats. The justice of the peace smelled of pipe tobacco and seemed deeply uninterested in the ceremony. There were no flowers. No guests. Elias signed the paper, Clara signed the paper, and they drove back to the ranch in the wagon with the late afternoon sun painting the desert floor in long ribbons of orange and red. They ate supper that night, beans, cornbread, dried beef, and Clara did the dishes without being asked and without any comment. When she was finished, she looked around the kitchen with the careful, assessing eye of a woman who has walked into many difficult situations and made peace with each of them. She said, "I'll fix the porch." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." And she went to bed in the second room, the one he'd cleared of old equipment and put a cot in. And Elias sat at the table and drank his coffee and thought about what he'd just done. He'd bought a wife. That was the plain truth of it, no matter how you dressed it. And she had bought a shield. That was the plain truth of hers. Neither of them was pretending it was something else. And somehow, that honesty, cold and practical as it was, felt more solid to Elias than anything romantic had ever felt in his life. But there was still the matter of Harlan Voss. And Harlan Voss, Elias would come to learn, was not a man who let distance slow him down for long. 3 weeks after Clara arrived, a rider came to the edge of the property line and sat his horse there for a full 10 minutes, watching the house. He didn't come closer. He didn't need to. The message was in the watching, patient, deliberate, and entirely without mercy. He came back 2 more times before Clara saw him. The first time, Elias was mending the south fence line when he spotted the horse on the ridge, a gray stallion, well-fed and well-kept, which meant money. The rider sat perfectly still against the morning sky, silhouetted sharp and dark, and Elias watched him for a while with his hand resting easy near his rifle. After about 10 minutes, the rider turned and rode back over the ridge and was gone. The second time was at dusk. Elias was at the well. The rider appeared at the same ridge, same gray horse, same absolute stillness, and this time he was there for almost 20 minutes before disappearing into the dark. Elias told Clara that evening, casually, the way you mentioned the weather. She put down her fork. Her face went still, not afraid, something more controlled than fear. She said, "He's mapping the property. He's looking at the approach, the sight lines, the distances. He's not going to rush." Elias said, "You know this man well." She said, "I know what kind of man he is. I've known men like him my whole life. They're patient when patience serves them. They don't make mistakes they don't have to make. And what does he want, exactly? Be specific with me, Clara." She looked at him then, long enough that it meant something. She said, "He wants me to sign over the Millard County land. If I do that, he'll disappear. He's not interested in me personally. I want you to understand that. I'm just an obstacle. He's a business problem wearing a human face. And if you don't sign?" She looked back at her plate. "Then he escalates until I do." The third time the rider appeared, Clara was hanging laundry on the line strung between the porch and the old cottonwood. She turned and saw the gray horse on the ridge, and she stood very still, a sheet held in both hands, and she stared at him. He stared back. Then, slowly, he removed his hat, not in greeting, in something else, something colder, and replaced it, and rode away. Clara came inside and said nothing about it. But that night, when she thought Elias was asleep, he heard her moving quietly in the kitchen. He got up. She was sitting at the table with a small leather case open in front of her. Inside it were papers, folded and aged. The Millard County deed. And beside it, a small, pearl-handled revolver. He stood in the doorway. She looked up at him without surprise or embarrassment. She said, "I've been carrying both of these since before I answered your advertisement." He said, "I noticed the revolver when you arrived." "I figured you had your reasons." She said, "I do." He said, "What does the deed say, exactly? About who it belongs to?" She slid it across the table. He sat down and read it by lamplight. It was clear. It was legal. Her husband, Thomas Voss, had left the Millard County parcel to Clara Voss, his wife, free and clear. The lawyer's seal was intact. The witnesses were named. Elias put it down. He said, "This is solid." She said, "Harlan has an affidavit from a man claiming the signature was obtained under duress. The man's name is Ray Dalton. He's Harlan's cousin. A bought witness. A bought witness with a local judge who owes Harlan 3 years of gambling debts." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a lawyer in Tucson. Name of Barrows. He's not cheap, but he's honest, and honest lawyers tend to win in the long run." Clara looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. She said, "You said you'd be the wall?" "You didn't say anything about fighting." He said, "I'm a rancher, Clara. I don't know how to stand still." She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to it, and it surprised him, not because she smiled, but because it changed her face entirely. Briefly made her look like someone who hadn't been carrying all that weight forever. Then the smile was gone. Because outside, somewhere in the desert dark, a horse was moving. Slow, deliberate hooves on dry ground. Coming closer than the ridge. Both of them heard it at the same moment. And both of them reached for the same thing, Elias for his rifle propped by the door, Clara for the pearl-handled revolver on the table, and without a single word between them. They moved together toward the window with the ease of people who have been a team for years rather than weeks. It was the first time Elias Cord noticed that this arrangement had quietly become something he didn't quite have a word for. The hoofbeats stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. He came to the front door in the morning. Not the ridge, not the dark, broad daylight, 10 o'clock, riding up the wagon track like a man who'd been invited, unhurried and unafraid, 2 riders flanking him at a respectful distance. Elias was on the porch when they came. He hadn't gone out to meet them, he'd watched them from the moment they cleared the mesquite stand at the property edge, and he'd stood up from his chair slowly, unhurriedly, and put his coffee down. And waited. Harlan Voss was not what you'd expect from a villain. He was perhaps 40, lean and well-dressed, with a trimmed beard and boots that cost more than most men in Red Rock Flats made in a month. His face was pleasant, that was the word. Pleasant. Open. The face of a man who had practiced looking harmless until it became second nature. He stopped his horse at the base of the porch steps, and removed his hat and smiled. He said, "Morning. I'm looking for a woman named Clara Voss. I believe she goes by Cord now. I'm her late husband's brother, come to deliver some family effects she left behind." Elias said, "Nice try." The smile stayed exactly where it was. "I beg your pardon? There are no family effects. There's a land dispute. And you know I know that, because you've been sitting your horse on my ridge for 3 weeks watching my house." A pause. The 2 flanking riders shifted slightly, not reaching for their guns, just repositioning, the way horses do when they feel the tension in the air. Harlan said, "You're direct." "I respect that. You can respect it from the road, Mr. Cord." The pleasantness dropped a fraction. Not much, just enough to show what was underneath, like seeing the edge of a blade through a coat. "I have no quarrel with you. None whatsoever. This is a matter between family members, and it will resolve itself peacefully if the right documents are signed. I'm not a violent man. Every violent man I've ever met said that." Harlan looked past Elias toward the door. "Is she home?" "She's my wife. This is my land. You can talk to me. With respect, the matter concerns property that, with respect," Elias said, and his voice was flat and even as the desert floor. "The matter concerns a woman who lives under my roof and my protection, on land registered to my name in Red Rock County. If you have legal business with the Millard County estate, you can take it to a court. If you step off that road onto my property without an invitation, I'll treat it accordingly." His hand had not moved toward the rifle leaning against the porch post. He didn't need to move it. The rifle was simply there, and Harlan Voss understood distances and sight lines. That was why he'd spent 3 weeks studying them. Harlan put his hat back on. He said, "You're protecting a woman you married 6 weeks ago. A woman you barely know. I wonder if she's told you everything, Mr. Cord." "I know what I need to know." "Does she?" A pause. "Ask her about Millard City. Ask her what happened the night Thomas died. Ask her why the doctor's report doesn't match what she told the sheriff." He said it conversationally, pleasantly, the way you mention weather. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the track, his 2 men following, taking their time, not looking back. Elias stood on the crooked porch and watched them until they were dust. Then he went inside. Clara was in the kitchen. She'd heard all of it. The window was open, she hadn't tried to hide that she was listening. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, and she didn't turn around. He said, "What happened the night Thomas died?" A long silence. "The kind with real weight." She said, "He fell from his horse during a night ride. The doctor who wrote the report was drunk when he examined the body. His notes were incomplete." Harlan used that incompleteness to suggest something that wasn't true. Was it an accident? She turned around then. Her eyes were clear, not the clarity of innocence, the clarity of a woman who has answered this question to herself 1,000 times and arrived at the same answer every time. She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and poured himself more coffee. She said, "You believe me?" Not a question. Something between surprise and something harder to name. He said, "I believe the deed. I believe the lawyer's seal. I believe you traveled 300 miles alone to marry a man you never met rather than sign over land that was legally yours. Guilty people don't fight that hard." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Elias." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He didn't make anything of it out loud. But he noticed it. And the kitchen felt, for just a moment, like a warmer room than it had been all morning. Outside, somewhere down the wagon track, Harlan Voss was riding back toward town. And he was already planning his next move. Elias could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the clouds arrive. He just didn't know yet that Harlan's next move wouldn't involve him at all. The fire started at midnight. Not the house, the barn. Elias smelled it before he heard it, that sharp particular smell of burning hay mixed with something chemical, something poured, something deliberate. He was out of bed and through the door in seconds, and he could see the glow from the east end of the barn, orange light pulsing against the dark desert sky like a second and terrible sunrise. He got the cattle out. That was the first thing, the panicked bawling, the heat pressing against his face as he forced himself into the smoke to throw open the gates. The cattle pushing past him in a blind stampede of fear and muscle. He got most of them. He lost 4, 2 to the smoke, 2 to the panic of the night, disappeared into the desert dark, never found. Clara had come out behind him with the water bucket line. She'd organized it herself, not waiting to be told. Working the relay from the well with a calm and ferocity that later he would think about more than the fire itself. She knew what she was doing. She worked until her arms shook and kept working. They saved the west end of the barn. The east end was a loss. When the sun came up, Elias stood in front of the blackened wreckage and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. He'd been angry before, it came and went. This was older and colder than anger. This was the feeling of a man who has just understood that the problem in front of him has no clean solution. Clara stood beside him. She was covered in ash and her hair had come loose and she had a burn on her left forearm, small, already blistered, that she hadn't mentioned and wouldn't mention until he noticed it and insisted she let him bandage it. She said, "He couldn't touch you legally. So he touched the land. It was arson. Can you prove it?" He looked at the ruins. He said, "Not without a witness." "Then legally, it was an accident." "Legally." They stood there for a while. A red-tailed hawk was circling somewhere above, riding the thermals that the dying fire still produced, patient and indifferent. Elias said, "I'm going to ride into town." "And do what?" "Talk to the sheriff. Harlan's men have been drinking at the saloon for 3 days. They have an alibi." "They planned this well, Elias." "Then I'll talk to Barrows, the lawyer. It'll take time. And while it takes time, I know." He was already walking toward the corral for his horse. "I know," she said. "He'll come back. Not his men, him. In person. He'll make an offer. He'll be reasonable and generous, and the offer will be an insult, and he'll make it calmly and watch us refuse it, and then something else will burn." He stopped walking. He turned. She said, "I've seen this before. In Millard County. He did it to a neighbor who was in his way. 2 fires, then a broken leg, a riding accident, then the man sold. I'm not selling. I know you're not. But I need you to understand what the cost of that looks like, because you agreed to stand with me, and I never." She stopped. Something flickered in her face, the first real crack in that composed, controlled exterior. Something that looked briefly like guilt. "I never told you it would be this." Elias looked at her standing in front of his ruined barn, with ash in her hair and a burned arm and the weight of something she'd carried alone for a long time pressing down on her shoulders, and he felt something he absolutely was not prepared to feel. He said, "Clara, look at me." She did. He said, "I shook your hand at a depot. I signed my name beside yours at a courthouse. Out here, that means something. You understood that when you made the arrangement. So did I." She said nothing. He said, "I'm going to Tucson. I'm going to see Barrows. I'm going to file every legal motion that man can think of against Harlan Voss, and his bought witness, and his corrupt judge. And while I'm doing that, I need you to stay inside, keep that pistol close, and trust Decker, my foreman, because I'm leaving him here until I get back." A pause. She said, "How long will you be gone?" 3 days. Maybe 4. She nodded. Then she said, "Elias, be careful." It was not, he understood, a casual phrase. It was the closest she'd come to saying something that had nothing to do with the arrangement at all. He rode for Tucson. He made it 20 miles before the 2 riders appeared from behind a mesa and blocked the road. They weren't Harlan's men. They were carrying a U.S. Marshal's badge. And they said they needed to ask Elias Cord some questions about the murder of a man named Thomas Voss. The Marshal's name was Reeves. He was a thin, sun-baked man with a gray mustache and the manner of someone who had heard every story and believed about half of them. He rode beside Elias, not arresting him, he was careful to say, just asking for his cooperation, and the 3 of them went into Red Rock Flats and sat down in the sheriff's office. Reeves laid it out simply. A formal complaint had been filed in Tucson 3 days prior, alleging that Thomas Voss's death had been the result of foul play and that his widow, now Clara Cord, had been in the company of another man in the weeks before Thomas died. The complaint named the other man. It named Elias. Elias sat very still. "I've never been to Millard County in my life," Reeves said. "I believe you. Then what is this?" "This," Reeves said, setting down the papers, "is Harlan Voss trying to remove you from the equation. If you're under investigation, you can't travel. You can't visit lawyers. You're occupied. And while you're occupied, he gets to Clara. He gets to your wife with an offer. And this time, she's alone." Elias stood up. Reeves did not move to stop him. He said, "How long does the complaint keep me here?" Reeves said, "Legally, I can hold you 24 hours for questioning. After that," he paused, "I could decide the complaint lacks sufficient basis to pursue. Something passed between them, not corruption, not a deal, something cleaner. One honest man signaling to another honest man what the shape of the situation was." Elias said, "How fast can you make that decision?" Reeves said. How fast can you answer my questions? He answered them. 2 hours. Every detail clear, calm, documented. His whereabouts on every date named. His first contact with Clara, the letter, the advertisement, the depot. He had no connection to Thomas Voss's death because he had never crossed paths with Thomas Voss. He was a rancher in Red Rock Flats who had married a widow, and the widow's dead husband's brother was trying to steal her land. Reeves listened to all of it. He wrote some notes. Then he put his pen down. He said, I have some knowledge of Harlan Voss. Not official knowledge. The kind of knowledge that accumulates around a certain type of man over time. And I think you need to get back to your ranch. Now. Elias was on his horse in 3 minutes. He rode hard, harder than was smart in midday desert heat, pushing his horse close to the edge of what was safe. Because something in the back of his chest was pulling tight and wouldn't let him slow down. He'd been gone 8 hours. Decker was there. Clara had the revolver. He told himself these things against the pull in his chest, and they didn't help much. He came over the last rise and saw the ranch below him, and it was fine. No smoke, no riders, everything apparently still and ordinary, and he let out the breath he'd been holding for 8 hours. Then he saw the gray horse, tied to his own porch post. Alone. Harlan Voss's horse. He came down the hill at a controlled gallop and pulled up at the yard and swung down with his hand already on his rifle and took in the scene in a single second, the front door open. Decker sitting against the cottonwood with a wound on his head that was bleeding but not badly, conscious and angry, and from inside the house, voices. He went through the door. Clara was standing at the kitchen table. Harlan Voss was across from her, and one of his men was near the window, gun holstered, hands visible, but present, a weight in the room. On the table between Clara and Harlan was a single piece of paper. The deed. And beside it, another document, and a pen. Harlan looked up when Elias came in. He seemed neither surprised nor alarmed. He said, Mr. Court, your foreman had an accident. He's fine. I can see that. Clara had not looked away from Harlan. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the deed, and the pearl-handled revolver was not in sight, which meant she'd put it somewhere before they came in. Which meant she'd had some warning. Harlan said, We were just concluding our business. Elias said, Were you? Harlan said, The document on the table is a voluntary transfer of the Millard County property to the Voss family estate. It requires only Clara's signature. In exchange, I'm prepared to offer. He named a sum not insulting, actually reasonable by any objective measure, and complete withdrawal of all legal actions, complaints, and interests in the matter. Elias looked at Clara. She looked at him. And in that look, which lasted perhaps 2 seconds and contained about 10 years' worth of communication, something was decided. Elias said, Clara. She said, Yes? He said, Is this what you want to do? Not, don't sign it. Not, I'll handle this. He asked her. Her choice. Her land. Her life. Something shifted in her face. He saw it. Harlan saw it too, and his expression flickered with the first real uncertainty he'd shown. Clara said, No. It is not. She picked up the deed, the original, her deed, and folded it and held it against her chest. Harlan said, I would strongly, U.S. Marshal Reeves is aware of this situation. Elias said. He's also aware of the fraudulent complaint you filed this morning, and of your history in Millard County, and of your cousin Ray Dalton's affidavit. He finds it all very interesting. A pause. He also knows you're on my property right now without invitation. The man by the window straightened. Harlan was very still. You're bluffing, he said. But his voice had lost that pleasant quality. Just slightly. Just enough. Elias said. Ride back to wherever you came from. Talk to your lawyers. File your papers in whatever court will take them. we'll file ours. And when it's over, and it will be over, that land will still belong to my wife. A silence stretched out in the kitchen. Long enough that the clock on the shelf ticked through it 4 times. Then Harlan Voss picked up the unsigned document, folded it, put it in his coat. He said nothing. He walked to the door, his man following. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at Clara, not Elias, and the look was cold and calculating and patient, the look of a man who was not done but was choosing to wait. Then he left. They listened to the hoofbeats fade. Elias went to check on Decker. Clara didn't move. When he came back in, she was still standing at the table, holding the deed against her chest with both arms, and her eyes were bright in a way he'd never seen before, not tears. Something harder than tears, something that happens when a person has been afraid for so long that finally, briefly, the fear breaks open and becomes something else. She said, "You came back." He said, "I said I would." She said, "I know. But," she stopped. Started again. "I came here because I needed a wall. That was all I let myself need." "A wall," he said, "and?" A long pause. She looked at him across the kitchen of the crooked porch house in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. She said, "And I think I got something I didn't put in the condition." Harlan Voss did not disappear that day. He filed 3 more legal motions over the following 4 months. Barrows, the Tucson lawyer, answered everyone. Reeves provided a deposition about Dalton's credibility that proved devastating in court. The bought judge recused himself under pressure. A new judge read the deed and the lawyer's seal and the witness signatures and threw out Harlan's claim in 20 minutes. The Millard County land stayed Clara's. She sold it the following spring, her choice, entirely hers, and used the proceeds to rebuild the east end of the barn. Better than before. Stronger. With a foundation that wouldn't shift. She fixed the porch, too. The lean was gone. Elias noticed it one morning, standing on it with his coffee, watching the desert come alive in the early light. He stood there for a long time, straight-footed on level boards, thinking about conditions and arrangements, and the things that grow quietly in hard ground without anyone planning for them. Clara came out behind him, her own coffee in hand. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The desert was impossibly wide and impossibly quiet and impossibly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you've earned the right to look at them without fear. And the silence between them, for the first time in a very long time for both of them, had no weight at all. Here is what the history books don't tell you about the Wild West. They tell you about the outlaws, the gunfighters, the great cattle drives and the gold rushes and the lawmen who drew faster than death. They don't tell you about the quiet ones. The ones who survived not by shooting first, but by deciding, carefully and deliberately, what they were worth and what they would not give up. Clara Cord kept her land and her name, and the one condition that had changed everything. She never thought of it as buying a husband. She thought of it as finding out what fair treatment actually looked like in practice, and discovering that it looked, after all, something like a man who asked her what she wanted before he said a word. Elias Cord never thought of it as buying a wife. He thought of it as the strangest, most honest transaction of his life, a business arrangement that turned out to be something arrangements almost never are. Real. The porch never leaned again. And on nights when the coyotes talked and the stars spread out above the flats like God had bothered this time to do it carefully, on those nights, the silence in Elias Cord's chest was finally, completely, and irrevocably gone. Not because he'd fought for it. Because someone had stood beside him and let him fight for her. And in the end, out in that vast, brutal, beautiful desert, that was the only kind of victory worth having. Some men ride into the West looking for gold. The lucky ones find something they weren't looking for at all. And they spend the rest of their lives being grateful they didn't know what to ask for.